We're speaking, of course, about climate change. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called findings by a United Nations report a code red for humanity. He says, and I quote, "The alarm bells are deafening. The evidence is irrefutable. We're on course for disaster." And so, what is South Africa's response to all of this? What is our role? And how do we map out a clean energy future going forward? I'm pleased to tell you, Barbara Creecy, the Minister of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, is on the line to discuss this. Minister, thank you for your time this morning.
Morning, Bongani, and good morning to all of your listeners.
I mean, in a sense, the UN is telling us what we sort of already knew, but to hear it in this dramatic tone was quite something.
Yes, I think that this is a very significant report that has taken over 7 years to produce. And it obviously made headlines around the world because of its very dire predictions with regard to the impact of climate change for humanity. But I think more importantly, it must help to inform international policy making at COP26 and, of course, for us on a domestic level.
COP26, of course, is just 3 months away in Glasgow in Scotland. Do you think this will have an impact on international policy and how countries frame their response to climate change, when it does also appear so many countries are still in some form of denial about this?
Well, I think that we have seen as countries, and particularly the big countries with the biggest economies in the world, so the United States, China, the European Union, Japan, Korea, and so on. We've seen those countries as they have emerged from the COVID pandemic making mid-century commitments to zero carbon emissions. And I think that those commitments are extremely important. The report says that is necessary if we're to avoid a temperature increase of more than 2% above pre-industrial times. But the report also says that it would be much better if we could keep average global temperature increases below the 1.5 degree mark, and that means that we've got to significantly, all of us, cut our carbon budgets over the next 10 years. South Africa is committed to doing our bit. We're a very small emitter. We're only responsible for about 1% of global emissions. But we are committed to putting together an enhanced nationally determined contribution to cutting greenhouse gases. We've already tabled the first proposal, and we're in the process of reviewing all of the comments that we have received from the public. And I think that we understand that President Ramaphosa described climate change as the greatest existential crisis facing humanity. So I think that as a country, we fully understand the implications of this, and we have to look at how we do our bit and how we contribute to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions.
Absolutely. I mean, to his credit, the president did convene a climate change commission to advise government on how we're going to do exactly what you've just said. And that commission, of course, has recommended much tougher targets than what we had previously committed to. You say we're not necessarily one of the biggest, but we are sitting at number 14 in terms of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. So even as there is awareness and commitments by the president, there's more we can do.
Yes, I think that the big issue that we all understand about South Africa is that we're 90% dependent on coal-fired energy generation. And what that means is that all of our goods and services have a very high carbon footprint. In addition to this very disturbing scientific evidence that we've had put before us, we also understand as an emerging and developing economy that we face what we call a transition risk. And what this means is that as our major trading partners move away from high carbon economies, they are going to want to protect their investments in green technology, and we could in due course be facing non-tariff trade barriers for our goods and services. So I think that our commitment to moving to a lower carbon economy and a more climate resilient society is motivated both by the moral and ethical issues related to climate change, but also to economic considerations.
But if I look at our draft electricity plan, it's still proposing new coal plants being built well after 2030. So are we not speaking with a forked tongue there?
Well, I think that there is consideration taking place at the moment, and this is why the work of the Climate Change Commission is so important, as to exactly what are the development pathways to achieve our aspiration of being net carbon zero by 2050. That obviously means that we will have, over the next 10 years, to significantly increase our renewable energy generation. We will also have to look at the implications for the transport sector and the manufacturing sector. And I think that if you look at the shift that is taking place in the private sector, where many major companies, such as Anglo American and Exxaro, have made a net 2050 commitment, one is seeing that we're all grappling with what this transition actually means and what pathways we would have to adopt.
Minister, how much teeth does your department have ultimately in stopping processes that will lead us back, that are taking us in the wrong direction? There is a perception that your ministry is second fiddle, really, to the Department of Minerals and Energy, for example.
Look, I don't think that any one ministry, and let me put it very clearly, government itself can manage this transition on its own. Because what we understand is that the economy is primarily being driven by the private sector, and we also understand that in this transition, there's a very important concept, and that is the concept of justice, a just transition. And really what that's saying is that there are 100,000 people employed in the coal value chain in South Africa. As we transition over the next 20 years, 20, 30 years, we are going to have to make sure that those people are not the people who carry the burden disproportionately of this transition. We're going to have to make sure that new technology and new forms of energy generation produce jobs, and we're going to have to put up new industries and new forms of livelihood creation in those towns in Mpumalanga that are so very dependent on the coal value chain.
Look, Minister, I don't want to argue in circles, but I do think that, if we're still planning to build coal plants beyond 2030, that doesn't suggest a commitment to a transition. But let's talk about something that perhaps is a little bit more current. Your department, of course, put a spanner in the works as far as the Kapowership deal is concerned because of environmental impact assessments that were not done. It would appear, though, that your counterpart at Energy, Minister Gwede Mantashe, has given them a lifeline. And in fact, he's spoken about not booking any delays as far as the procurement of this emergency power, despite what your officials have said.
Bongani, I'm the appeal authority in this matter. What that means is that I have to consider all the facts in what would be equivalent to a new consideration. I think that in order not to compromise that process, I would not want to comment on the car power issue at this stage. In due course, when I have applied my mind to the appeal that is in process, we will be able to comment.
Sure, but when Minister Mantashe says this is emergency power,
I'm not going to comment on this matter.
Are you being placed under pressure in any way, or do we just leave it at that?
Bongani, I've said I'm not commenting on this matter. It's in an appeal phase. Let's do justice to the process.
And ultimately, of course, even if that decision were to go against what people want, there's still avenues to deal with that. Ultimately, if we look at the global north, and I started this conversation in that direction, I'm looking at comments now that have come out of the Australian government about fear porn as far as this UN report that the sky is not caving in, even as our exports may be punished, I suppose, in the near future. Many of the countries, our largest trading partners, are bigger emitters than we are. Are we being put in an unfair position simply because we're not the biggest player at the table?
Look, I think that one of the issues that South Africa is part of the African group of negotiators at COP26 will put on the table, and we put it on the table when we were in the UK 2 weeks ago, and we've put it on the table in Madrid, is that ambition for developing countries, ambition in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation, is fundamentally dependent on means of implementation. In other words, financial and technological resources from developed countries. The UNFCCC puts an obligation on developed countries to help developing countries with regard to climate change. This obligation has not been adequately met, and it's something that we will continue to demand, because if we are responsible for 1% of global emissions, what it means is that there are countries who have significantly contributed to the problem we are facing, and they need to be supporting those countries that will be most affected, and we know that Southern Africa will be severely affected by climate change in our response. So we will continue to lobby for this, because we think that climate justice is not just about issues within one country, but it's also about the way in which the developed countries that have benefited from the carbon economies help developing countries, least developed countries, small island states that are in danger of sinking into the sea. That is part of what the concept of climate justice is all about.
Barbara Creecy, appreciate your time, the Minister of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.